Welcome to the extremely boring stories today we listening, the tradition from the medieval era that we still follow. Imagine you are walking down a narrow, timber-framed street in a 13th century European city, perhaps Bruges, London, or Cologne. The air is thick with the scent of wood smoke, tan leather, and damp stone. As you navigate the cobblestones, you notice something peculiar about the storefronts. There are no neon signs, no printed advertisements, and very few words written in the windows. Instead, you see symbols, a golden key, a carved wooden boot, a pewter flagon. These are more than just signs, they are the physical manifestations of the guild system. A structure of labor and education that still dictates how you work, learn, and prove your worth in the 21st century. You might think of tradition as something grand, a coronation or a holiday. But the most enduring medieval tradition you follow is likely your career path. When you look at a university diploma or a professional license, you are looking at a direct descendant of the medieval guild. To understand why we value these credentials today, you must first understand the meticulous, often tedious, bureaucracy of the medieval artisan. In the medieval world, you could not simply decide to be a blacksmith or a weaver. Trade was not a free-for-all, it was a highly regulated, closed-loop system designed to ensure stability, quality, and, most importantly, social order. The guild was the heart of this system. It was a combination of a labor union, a regulatory body, a social club, and a religious fraternity. If you wanted to practice a craft, the guild owned the rights to that craft within the city walls. The journey began in early adolescence. Imagine yourself as a 12-year-old child, perhaps the son or daughter of a modest farmer or a city laborer. Your parents have saved a small sum of money to pay an entry fee to a master. You sign a contract, an indenture. This document is a legal bond that ties you to a master for 7 years. During this time, you are not a student in the modern sense, you are an apprentice. You live in the master's house, you eat at his table, and you perform the most menial tasks imaginable. You sweep the workshop, you haul charcoal, you sort raw materials. This period of apprenticeship was designed to be long and intentionally slow. It was a test of endurance as much as skill. The guilds believed that true knowledge could not be hurried. It had to be absorbed through the pores over years of repetitive, boring labor. You were watching the master's hands, learning the mysteries of the trade, the specific chemical ratios for dye, the exact temperature of a forge, the way a needle should pull through heavy canvas. These were trade secrets, guarded with the same intensity that a modern corporation guards its intellectual property. As you spent your teenage years in this environment, you were participating in the first iteration of what we now call accreditation. The master was responsible not just for your skills, but for your soul and your behavior. If you were caught gambling or brawling in the streets, it reflected poorly on the guild. The tradition of the professional code of ethics begins here, in the cold workshops of the Middle Ages, where your personal character was considered inseparable from your professional output. But what happened when your 7 years were up? You were no longer an apprentice, but you were not yet a master. You became a journeyman. The word comes from the French journée, meaning day. You were now a worker who could be paid by the day. You were free to travel from city to city, seeking work with different masters to broaden your experience. This is the ancestor of the modern internship or junior associate role. You were a skilled laborer, but you lacked the capital and the official recognition to open your own shop. The transition from journeyman to master was the most grueling part of the process. To prove you were worthy of joining the elite ranks of the guild, you had to produce a specific piece of work that demonstrated every skill you had acquired. You had to create a masterpiece. Today, we use that word to describe a work of great art, but in the 14th century, a masterpiece was a practical exam. It was a lock that couldn't be picked, a suit of armor that fit perfectly, or a tapestry with no visible knots. You would present this work to the guild elders, the wardens. They would inspect it with a cold, clinical eye, looking for the slightest flaw. If you passed, you paid another set of heavy fees, took a solemn oath, and were finally allowed to hang your own sign and train your own apprentices. You were now a master of arts or a master of your craft. Consider the language we still use today. When you graduate from a university, you might receive a master's degree. When you work in a trade, you might strive to be a master electrician or a master plumber. Even the structure of the university itself, with its bachelor's a term for a young knight or junior member, masters, and doctors from the Latin docere, to teach is a direct transplant of the guild hierarchy into the world of academia. The guilds also introduced the concept of the standard. In a world without government inspectors, the guild served as the guarantor of quality. If you bought a loaf of bread in a medieval city and it was filled with sawdust, the Bakers' Guild would find the culprit, fine them, and perhaps even banish them from the trade. They protected the brand of the city's industry. This boring, repetitive inspection of goods created the foundation for our modern consumer protection laws and ISO standards. Every time you look for a UL sticker on an appliance or a certified seal on a document, you are participating in a tradition established by men in wool tunics who were obsessed with the quality of pewter spoons and woolen cloth. They understood that trust was the only thing that allowed a market to function. But beneath this orderly surface of apprentices and masterpieces, there was a darker side to the guilds. They were exclusive. They were often hereditary. And they were fiercely protective of their monopolies. As the medieval era progressed, the gap between the wealthy masters and the perpetual journeymen, who could never afford the fees to become masters themselves, began to widen. This tension created a shift in the way labor was organized, leading to some of the first recorded strikes and labor disputes in history. As you imagine yourself standing in that medieval workshop, surrounded by the smell of sawdust and the rhythmic sound of a hammer, you have to wonder, was this system designed to foster excellence, or was it simply a way to keep the number of competitors low? The master is watching you now, his arms crossed, waiting for you to finish the repetitive task he assigned you 4 hours ago. He holds the key to your future, but the rules of the game are beginning to change. The guilds controlled the physical world, the locks, the clothes, the bread. But they were also beginning to control the world of ideas. And as the cities grew and the first universities began to form, the Guild of Scholars started to apply these same rigid, boring, and essential rules to the human mind. As you step out of the blacksmith's smoky workshop and move toward the cathedral district of a medieval city, the sounds change. The rhythmic clanging of hammers is replaced by a low, melodic hum, the sound of Latin being chanted, debated, and scribbled onto parchment. You are entering the world of the universitas, a word that, in the 12th century, didn't mean a campus or a library, but simply a corporation or a guild. Just as the weavers and stonemasons formed guilds to protect their trade secrets, the teachers and students of Europe began to form guilds of scholars. You might find it surprising that your modern university experience, from the stressful final exams to the specific phrasing on your diploma, is essentially a 13th century labor union strategy that never went away. Imagine yourself as a student in Paris or Bologna around the year 1250. You are not sitting in a comfortable lecture hall with a laptop. You are sitting on a floor covered in straw to keep your feet warm, listening to a master read from a rare, hand-copied manuscript. In this era, books were so expensive that a single volume could cost as much as a small house. The master's job was to lecture, a word derived from the Latin lexio, meaning a reading. You are there to hear the text because you cannot afford to own it. The tradition here is the lecture itself. For 800 years, we have maintained the model of an expert standing at the front of a room, speaking to a group of people who take notes. Even in the age of the internet, you still find yourself in this medieval ritual. But why did they do it? It wasn't just about sharing information, it was about the licentia docendi, the license to teach. To get this license, you had to follow a path that mirrored the blacksmith's apprenticeship exactly. In the medieval university, your apprenticeship was the study of the 7 liberal arts. First came the trivium, grammar, logic, and rhetoric. These were the boring foundations, the tools of the mind. You spent years learning how to construct a sentence, how to spot a logical fallacy, and how to persuade an audience. Only after mastering these could you move on to the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. You were a bachelor's student during this time. The term baccalaureus likely referred to a staff bearer or a junior knight, someone who was in service but not yet a leader. You were halfway up the ladder. To move higher, you had to prove your skill through the disputation. This is a part of the tradition that has evolved into the modern thesis defense. In a medieval disputation, you wouldn't just take a multiple-choice test. You would stand before a panel of masters and a crowd of your peers. Someone would propose a quaestio, a difficult question, such as whether the world is eternal or whether the soul occupies space. You had to argue one side using formal logic, citing authorities like Aristotle or St. Augustine from memory. You weren't just being tested on what you knew, you were being tested on your ability to perform under pressure. This was your masterpiece. If you survived the disputation, you were granted the title of Master of Arts. This wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a membership card. It gave you the legal right to teach anywhere in Christendom. You had moved from being a consumer of knowledge to a producer of it. The attire you see at modern graduations, the heavy black gowns, the hoods, and the mortarboard hats, is not just costume. It is a survival of medieval daily wear. In the unheated stone buildings of the 13th century, a long wool gown, a kappa and a hood were practical necessities for staying warm during 12-hour study sessions. The beretta or square cap was the standard headwear of the scholar. When you wear these today, you are literally dressing like a 14th century clerk. Even the colors on the hoods, green for medicine, blue for philosophy, red for law, date back to the specific liveries or uniforms that different guilds adopted to identify their members in a crowded city. But why has this stuck? Why, In a world of digital badges and skills-based hiring, do we still insist on this long, expensive, and often boring medieval process? The answer lies in the concept of the degree. The medieval university created a standardized currency for the mind. Before the guild system, you might be a very smart person. But how could a king or a bishop in a distant city know that? The degree served as a seal of quality control. It told the world that you had been vetted by the Guild of Scholars. It meant you had sat through the required number of lectures, passed the disputations, and adhered to the professional code. As you imagine yourself walking through the muddy streets of medieval Paris, clutching your hard-won parchment, you realize that the university was more than a school, it was a fortress. It protected the status of the educated class. It ensured that only those who had put in the time, the 7 years of boring, repetitive study, could claim the rewards. This brings us to a significant realization. Much of our modern life is built on these medieval fences. We have fences around professions licensing, fences around knowledge degrees, and even fences around the way we measure time and progress. The guild system didn't just organize work, it organized the human lifespan into stages: apprentice, journeyman, master. As you imagine yourself walking through the muddy streets of medieval Paris, clutching your hard-won parchment, you realize that the university was more than a school, it was a fortress. It protected the status of the educated class. It ensured that only those who had put in the time, the 7 years of boring, repetitive study, could claim the rewards. This brings us to a significant realization. Much of our modern life is built on these medieval fences. We have fences around professions licensing, fences around knowledge degrees, and even fences around the way we measure time and progress. The guild system didn't just organize work, it organized the human lifespan into stages: apprentice, journeyman, master. Yet, as the Middle Ages drew to a close, a new force began to challenge the guilds. The rise of the printing press and the expansion of global trade meant that knowledge and goods were moving faster than the slow, deliberate pace of the guilds could handle. The master's mark was still respected, but people were beginning to ask, what if the quality isn't just in the mark, but in the efficiency of the making? The guilds had survived by being slow and steady. But the world was about to become fast and unpredictable. This tension between the old way of careful, guild-protected craftsmanship and the new way of mass production and individual enterprise would shape the very foundations of the modern economy. You are left standing at the crossroads of the late Middle Ages. To your left is the cathedral and the university, representing the tradition of the mind. To your right is the market square, where the first independent merchants are starting to bypass the guilds. By the late 15th century, the guild system had reached its zenith. As you look around the guild halls of London or the sprawling universities of Prague, you see a world defined by the seal. Everything, from the bolt of cloth to the legal document to the scholar's mind, was stamped with an official mark of approval. This was the birth of the standardized world. But as the Middle Ages transitioned into the Renaissance, the guilds faced a paradox. The very thing that made them successful, their extreme attention to detail and slow, methodical training, began to clash with a world that was suddenly in a hurry. The printing press meant that a masterpiece of calligraphy was no longer the only way to produce a book. The opening of new trade routes meant that exotic goods were flooding markets, bypassing the local guilds that had controlled supply for centuries. However, the guilds did not simply vanish. They evolved. They became the hidden architecture of your modern professional life. Think about the way you find a doctor today. You don't look for the person with the flashiest advertisement, you look for the letters MD behind their name. Those letters are a direct linguistic fossil from the medieval medicinae doctor. The requirement that a doctor must graduate from an accredited school, complete a residency, a modern apprenticeship, and be licensed by a board. The modern guild is a carbon copy of the 13th century medical faculty's rules in Salerno or Montpellier. They believed that boring regulation was the only thing standing between the public and a charlatan. Even the way we celebrate success is a medieval hangover. When you see a grand opening ribbon-cutting ceremony, you are witnessing a secular version of the medieval ritual of taking sides in the formal, public handover of property or rights in front of witnesses to ensure the community recognized the new status. The guilds also gave us the concept of social security. Long before governments provided a safety net, the guilds looked after their own. If a master blacksmith died, the guild paid for his funeral. They provided a pension for his widow and ensured his children were apprenticed into a trade. This fraternal responsibility is the direct ancestor of modern labor unions, insurance companies, and even the employee benefits package you negotiate today. We still follow the tradition that your profession is not just what you do for money, but a community that owes you a degree of protection. As you reflect on the Master's Mark, you realize that your life is governed by these invisible medieval lines. You are part of a lineage that values the long way of doing things, the 4-year degree, the 3-year apprenticeship, the professional certification. We have kept these traditions because they provide a sense of order in a chaotic world. They tell us who is in and who is out, who is an expert and who is an amateur. The Middle Ages were not just a time of knights and castles, they were a time of intense, often tedious, organizational genius. The men and women of the guilds understood that for a society to function, people needed to trust that the bread was pure, the bridge was sturdy, and the teacher was wise. They built that trust through the boring application of rules, fees, and long years of study. But while the guilds organized how we work, another medieval force was organizing how we move. Outside the city walls, the king's deputies were beginning to claim authority over the very ground people walked upon. They were establishing a concept that would eventually dictate which side of the road you drive on and why you stop at a red light. The master has closed his shop for the evening. The students have extinguished their tallow candles in the dormitory. The city is quiet, but the structures they built are still standing, not in stone, but in the way we organize our lives. Close your eyes and imagine a road. Not the smooth, asphalt ribbon of a modern highway, but a medieval highway. In the 12th century, a road was not necessarily a physical object, it was a legal concept. It was a way across the land, often consisting of nothing more than deeply rutted tracks of mud, baked hard by the summer sun or turned into a treacherous slurry by the autumn rains. In this world, travel was an act of bravery, or perhaps desperation. Once you left the protection of your village or the stout stone walls of a city, you entered a jurisdictional no man's land. There were no police, no GPS, and no standardized maps. You moved through a patchwork of local lordships, where the laws of one valley might not apply in the next. Yet, it is in this chaotic, muddy landscape that the foundations of modern traffic law and public safety were laid. The tradition we follow today, the idea that the government is responsible for the safety of the public space, was born from a medieval legal doctrine known as the King's Peace. In the early medieval period, the peace was a personal bubble that surrounded the monarch. If you were in the king's presence, you were under his protection. To commit a crime in front of the king was not just a common felony, it was a personal insult to the crown, punishable by the most severe means. Over time, the king realized that for his kingdom to function, for taxes to be collected and for trade to flow, his peace needed to extend beyond his physical person. It needed to cover the roads. Specifically, it covered the chemin du roi, the king's highways. These were the four great Roman roads that still crisscrossed England and Europe, along with the major arteries connecting market towns. When you stepped onto one of these roads, you were legally stepping into the king's house. This meant that a robbery on the highway was a far more serious crime than a robbery in a private forest. By claiming the road, the king was claiming the right to regulate how you moved. You might find the details of medieval road maintenance boring, but they are the direct ancestors of your local Department of Transportation. There was a law called the Statute of Winchester of 1285. It is one of the most significant, yet dry, documents in history. It decreed that all highways leading from one market town to another must be cleared of brush and trees for 200 feet on either side. Why 200 feet? It wasn't for the view. It was a survival strategy. The law was designed to prevent highwaymen from lurking in the shadows to leap out at travelers. Every local landlord was responsible for this clearing. If they failed to keep the verge clear and a traveler was robbed, the landlord could be held liable. When you see the wide, mowed shoulders of a modern interstate, you are looking at the 700-year-old legacy of the Statute of Winchester. We still clear the sides of our roads because the medieval mind understood that visibility equals safety. But the King's Peace went further than just clearing bushes. It began to dictate the rule of the road. You may have wondered why half the world drives on the left and the other half on the right. This isn't an accidental quirk of history, it is a fossil of medieval combat and social etiquette. In the Middle Ages, most people were right-handed. If you were riding a horse along a narrow, muddy track and you encountered a stranger, you didn't know their intentions. By staying to the left, your right hand, your sword hand, was positioned between you and the stranger. It was a defensive posture, a way of signaling that you were prepared but not necessarily aggressive. Furthermore, a right-handed person finds it easier to mount a horse from the left side, and it's safer to do so from the side of the road rather than the middle of traffic. This custom became so deeply ingrained that when the first formal traffic ordinances were written, they simply codified what had been the way of the world for centuries. In 1756, the first official keep left rule was enacted for London Bridge. The reason we have a side of the road at all is because medieval travelers were constantly calculating the risk of a sudden skirmish. The road also created the concept of the common carrier. If you were a carter hauling wool from the Cotswolds to London, you were using the King's Highway for profit. In exchange for the protection of the King's Peace, you had certain boring obligations. You couldn't refuse to carry a traveler's goods without a valid reason, and you were responsible for the safety of the cargo. This is the origin of the liability laws that govern everything from Amazon deliveries to airline luggage today. As you imagine yourself walking along a medieval road, you begin to see that it wasn't just a path, it was a theater of governance. You see the milestones, reused Roman stones or new markers, that told you how far you were from the center of power. You see the toll gates where local lords, granted a patent by the king, collected pennies to pay for the bridge repairs they usually neglected. This system was far from perfect. The roads were often atrocious, the tolls were exploitative, and the peace was frequently broken. But the idea was there: the road belongs to everyone, and therefore, it belongs to the state to regulate. One of the most enduring and boring aspects of this tradition is the public right-of-way. In many parts of Europe, there are ancient ways that have existed since the medieval era. Even if a road now passes through a private farm or a billionaire's estate, the public often retains the right to walk it. This is because, in the medieval mind, once a road was dedicated to the king's peace, it could never truly be undedicated. As the sun begins to set on our medieval highway, the shadows of the cleared trees stretch across the mud. You realize that every time you stop at a stop sign or yield to an oncoming car, you are performing a ritual of social cooperation that was refined by people who traveled at 3 miles per hour. But as the roads connected the towns, another form of connection was being perfected inside the quiet scriptoriums of the monasteries. While the king was regulating the physical space, a few lonely monks were busy regulating the way we see the world through the written word. They were inventing the very shapes of the letters you are reading right now. As you continue your journey along the medieval highway, the concept of the king's peace begins to take on a more practical, even bureaucratic, tone. While the left-hand side of the road was a matter of survival for the traveler, the physical upkeep of the road was a matter of constant, boring legal tension between the crown, the church, and the peasantry. Imagine you are a villager in 14th century England. Every year, you are called upon for statute labor. This was a tradition that lasted for centuries, the requirement that every able-bodied man dedicate several days a year to repairing the local roads. There was no specialized machinery. You arrived with a shovel, a wooden cart, and perhaps a basket of stones. Your task was to fill the sloughs of despond, those deep, wagon-swallowing pits of mud, with whatever rubble was at hand. This tradition of local responsibility for public infrastructure is the direct ancestor of our modern property taxes. The medieval mind didn't believe the government should do the work, they believed the government should compel the work. This created a fascinating legal landscape. Because the road was the king's, but the dirt was the local lord's, a strange set of rules emerged regarding what you could and couldn't do at the edge of the path. Consider the verge. In modern terms, this is the grassy strip between the road and the fence. In the Middle Ages, the verge was a vital resource. Because the Statute of Winchester required the 200-foot clearance for safety, this land became a common space. It was here that the poorest members of society, those without land of their own, could graze a single cow or a few geese. We still see the verge today in our urban planning. When you see a sidewalk separated from the street by a strip of grass, or a nature strip in a suburb, You are looking at a space that was originally designed to prevent you from being murdered by a highwayman. The boring details of road drainage also provide a link to our modern world. Medieval engineers, often monks who specialized in hydraulics, realized that the greatest enemy of the king's peace was not the bandit, but the puddle. Water sits in a rut, softens the ground, and eventually turns a road into a swamp. They began to implement the camber arching the road so that water would run off into side ditches. If you look at any modern paved road today, you will notice it is slightly higher in the center than at the edges. We are still using the same geometric solution developed by medieval surveyors using nothing more than plumb bobs and spirit levels. However, the king's peace wasn't just about the dirt and the grass, it was about the liability. This is perhaps the most significant medieval tradition we still follow. If a bridge collapsed while you were crossing it, who was to blame? Medieval law developed a complex system of pious works. Building or repairing a bridge was considered an act of Christian charity, similar to giving to the poor. Many bridges were maintained by bridge chapels, small churches built right onto the stone piers where travelers would drop coins into a box in exchange for a prayer for a safe journey. This was the first toll. The money wasn't for profit, it was for the endowment of the bridge's survival. When the religious guilds were dissolved during the Reformation, the state had to take over these endowments. This transition created the first modern public works departments. The boring administrative task of tracking who owned which bridge and who was responsible for the mortar between the stones created the legal framework for our modern public liability. If you trip on a cracked sidewalk today and hold the city accountable, you are invoking a legal principle that was hammered out in the 1300s over a crumbling stone arch in a remote village. But as the roads grew safer and the legalities of the peace became more established, people began to move more than just their bodies and their cattle. They began to move information. As you walk, you might pass a messenger, a man wearing the king's livery, carrying a leather satchel. He is part of the cursus publicus of his day, moving letters from one castle to another. He is fast, he is focused, and he is utilizing a specific technology that we often take for granted, the way the words are actually written on the page. While the king was defining the boundaries of the road, the church was defining the boundaries of the sentence. In the quiet, cold scriptoriums of the great monasteries, a revolution was taking place in the way we use our eyes to read. Why do we use spaces between our words? Why do we use capital letters at the beginning of a sentence and a period at the end? To a medieval monk, these weren't just stylistic choices, they were essential tools for the preservation of the word. As the light fades on the King's Highway, we turn our attention from the wide open spaces of the countryside to the cramped, ink-stained desks of the Abbey. The next part of our journey explores how the boring work of a scribe created the visual language of the modern world. Take a moment to look at the words on this screen. Notice the shape of the letters, the tall stems of the H and L, the rounded bellies of the O and P, and the way each word is separated by a clear, distinct space. You likely take this for granted, as if the alphabet has always looked this way. But for a significant portion of human history, reading was an arduous, physical struggle. The reason you can skim this sentence with ease is thanks to a boring administrative revolution that took place in the monasteries of the 8th and 9th centuries. travel back in your mind to a scriptorium in Frankish Europe, around the year 780. You are in a long, drafty room filled with wooden desks. There is no heating, and the light comes from narrow windows that let in the gray, winter sun. You are a monk, and your entire life is dedicated to the slow, repetitive task of copying text. But you have a problem: the books you are copying from are a mess. In the late Roman and early medieval period, Latin was often written in scriptura continua, a continuous stream of capital letters with no spaces between words and no punctuation. It looked a little bit like this and was incredibly difficult to decipher. Reading was not a silent, private activity, it was a performance. You had to read the text aloud, sounding out the syllables just to figure out where one word ended and the next began. For a monk trying to study complex theology or a clerk trying to manage a kingdom, this was inefficient and prone to dangerous errors. Enter the man who would inadvertently design your modern computer fonts, Alcuin of York. Alcuin was a scholar invited to the court of Charlemagne, the king of the Franks. Charlemagne had a problem. He had built a massive empire, but his administrators couldn't read each other's handwriting. Every region had its own messy, cramped style of shorthand. A decree sent from Aachen to Marseille might be misinterpreted simply because the local scripts were so different. Charlemagne tasked Alcuin with creating a universal script. The result was Carolingian minuscule. This might sound like a dry footnote in a history book, but it was a radical technological breakthrough. Alcuin and his team of scribes developed a set of rules for writing that were intentionally boring to ensure they were legible. First, they introduced lowercase letters. Before this, almost everything official was written in grand, imposing capitals. Lowercase letters, with their varied heights and shapes, are actually much easier for the human eye to recognize at high speeds. They also did something revolutionary. They introduced spaces between words. Imagine the mental relief of that simple change. By adding a tiny bit of nothingness between words, the monks transformed reading from a slow, phonetic puzzle into a visual process. You could suddenly see the meaning of a sentence without having to speak it. This birthed the tradition of silent reading. For the first time in history, you could hold a conversation with an author in the privacy of your own mind. As you sit at your desk in the monastery, your hand cramped from holding the quill, you are following a strict style guide. You must ensure that the ascenders, the top parts of letters like T, and descenders, the tails of letters like G, are uniform. This creates a horizontal lane for the eye to follow. You are also experimenting with a new mark to show where a thought ends, a small dot. The period or full stop was not a universal standard until this era. Neither was the comma or the question mark. These were metadata for the text, signals to the reader on how to breathe, how to pause, and how to emphasize certain words. We still use these medieval signals today because they provide the traffic laws for our thoughts. The work was grueling. A single Bible could take an entire year to copy. Scribes often wrote complaints in the margins of their pages: the hand aches, the back is bent, and the eyes are dim. Yet, they persisted because they believed that the clarity of the script was a reflection of the clarity of the divine. But there was another reason for this obsession with boring uniformity. As Charlemagne's empire grew, the written word became the primary tool of power. If a law was written in a clear, standardized script, it carried more authority. It looked official. We still follow this tradition today. When you see a document written in a formal, serif font like Times New Roman, your brain instinctively treats it with more seriousness than a document written in a casual script. That psychological reaction is a 1,200-year-old medieval reflex. As you finish your page of vellum, you carefully scrape away a mistake with a sharp knife, the medieval version of backspace. You are part of a global network of information workers who are standardizing the human experience. But as the scriptorium grows quiet, you realize that while you have organized the page, the world outside is still organized by something much more ancient and grounded, the soil. Even as the monks were standardizing the alphabet, the peasants in the fields were standardizing the very way the earth was divided. The shapes of the letters on the page began to be mirrored by the shapes of the fields in the valley. As you sit back on your hard wooden stool, the quill resting in its inkwell, you look at the page you've just completed. The Carolingian minuscule is beautiful in its simplicity. It lacks the aggressive, jagged spikes of later Gothic scripts. It is round, open, and clear. But Harlequin of York's revolution wasn't just about the shapes of the letters. It was about the standardization of the pause. Before this medieval movement, a writer didn't much care if you knew where a sentence ended. It was up to you, the reader, to find the rhythm. But as the Carolingian monks labored, they realized that if they wanted to preserve the precision of law and liturgy, they needed to provide a roadmap for the voice. They began to implement a system of distinctions, marks that told you how long to stop. The most humble of these was the punctus, a simple dot. Depending on where it was placed at the bottom, middle, or top of the line, it told the reader to take a short, medium, or long breath. This boring administrative detail is the direct ancestor of your period, your colon, and your comma. When you use a comma today to separate a list of groceries, you are using a survival tool designed by a monk who wanted to make sure his brothers didn't trip over their words during a midnight prayer service. There was also the matter of the question. How do you signal that a sentence is an inquiry before the reader reaches the end of it? The monks developed a mark called the punctus interrogativus. It looked a bit like a lightning bolt over a dot, signaling a rising intonation. This eventually smoothed out over centuries of fast copying into the question mark you use in every text message today. These symbols were the first user interface for the written word. They made the page scannable. But let's look closer at the parchment itself. In the medieval scriptorium, you weren't writing on paper. Paper was a Chinese invention that wouldn't become common in Europe for centuries. You were writing on vellum or parchment, processed animal skin. This material was incredibly expensive and durable. One large Bible could require the skins of over 200 sheep or calves. Because the material was so costly, you couldn't afford to waste a single inch. This led to another medieval tradition we follow, the margin. Scribes used a dry point or a lead weight to score invisible lines into the skin, ensuring the text stayed in a neat, rectangular block. They left wide margins not just for aesthetic beauty, but for metadata. The margins were where the gloss lived, commentaries, corrections, and cross-references. This layout, a central block of text surrounded by white space for notes, is exactly how a modern Microsoft Word document or a textbook is structured. We have inherited the architecture of the page from people who were trying to save money on sheepskins. The monks also standardized the table of contents and the index. As libraries grew from a dozen books to a few hundred, finding information became a logistical nightmare. The boring task of numbering pages and creating alphabetical lists of topics was a medieval necessity. They invented the way we navigate information. When you scroll through a website today, you are performing a digital version of unrolling a medieval codex, the first form of the modern book. As a scribe, your day was governed by the light. When the sun dipped below the abbey walls, your work ended. You couldn't use candles in the scriptorium because the risk of a fire destroying the library, thousands of hours of labor and dozens of animal lives, was too great. This enforced a rhythm of deep work during daylight hours that we often struggle to find in our age of artificial light. However, as the Middle Ages progressed, the scriptorium's monopoly on the written word began to crack. The rise of the universities, which we explored in Story 1, created a massive demand for books. The monks could no longer keep up. A new class of professional, secular scribes emerged, the stationers. They introduced the Pisha system, where a book was broken into sections so multiple people could copy parts of it simultaneously. This was the first assembly line for information. This shift from the monastery to the market square changed the script again. It became faster, tighter, and more cramped, leading to the blackletter or Gothic script that we now associate with old newspapers or heavy metal bands. But even as the style changed, the structure, the spaces, the periods, the lowercase letters, remained. As you look out the scriptorium window at the end of the day, you see the peasants returning from the fields. Their world is one of physical labor, measured by the strength of their arms and the endurance of their oxen. Just as you have organized the page into neat rows of text, they have organized the valley into neat rows of soil. You realize that the boring regularity of your letters is mirrored in the boring regularity of the landscape. The plow, like the quill, is a tool of standardization. Step away from the quiet, ink-stained desks of the monastery and move toward the edge of a 12th century village. The air here is different. It carries the scent of damp earth, livestock, and the sharp, metallic tang of cold iron. You are looking out over the open field system, a method of farming that dominated Europe for nearly 1,000 years. It is a landscape of boring regularity, yet it carved the very shapes of our modern world, from the length of a city block to the size of your suburban lawn. In the modern world, we think of a farm as a distinct square of land owned by one person and surrounded by a fence. But in the medieval mind, land was not a series of boxes, it was a series of strips. Imagine you are a peasant standing at the head of a massive, treeless expanse of land. This field is divided into hundreds of long, narrow ribbons of soil, separated not by fences, but by thin blocks of unplowed turf. You don't own one large block, you own 10 or 12 of these scattered strips, interspersed with the strips of your neighbors, the local priest, and the lord of the manor. This seems inefficient, even tedious. Why would you want your land spread out across 3 different fields? The answer lies in the medieval obsession with fairness and risk management. Because soil quality varied, one patch might be stony, another boggy, the community ensured that no one person held all the good land. Everyone shared the risk of a bad harvest. It was a boring but essential form of social insurance. But the most fascinating part of this tradition is the physical shape of the land itself. Why were the strips long and narrow? The answer is the heavy moldboard plow. Unlike the light scratch plows used in the dry soils of the Mediterranean, the Northern European plow was a massive, clunky piece of technology. It required a team of 8 oxen to pull it through the heavy, wet clay. As you can imagine, turning a team of 8 oxen and a heavy wooden plow is a logistical nightmare. It takes a lot of space and a lot of effort to wheel the team around. Therefore, once the team started moving, the farmer wanted to keep them going in a straight line for as long as possible. The result was the furlong, literally a furlong. This was the distance a team of oxen could plow before they needed to stop and catch their breath. In the medieval English system, this was standardized at 660 feet or about 201 meters. Because the turning was so difficult, the fields became long and narrow rather than square. This boring mechanical constraint of the ox team created the linear geometry of our landscape. Even today, many of our rural roads and property lines follow these ancient furlong boundaries. When you look at an aerial view of a modern city, the long, rectangular blocks of the street grid are often ghosts of the medieval strip farming patterns that existed before the city was built. And then there is the acre. We still use this unit today to measure everything from parks to real estate, but its definition is purely medieval. An acre was originally defined as the amount of land a single team of oxen could plow in one day. It was a unit of time and effort as much as it was a unit of space. It was standardized as a strip of land 1 furlong long and 4 rods wide, a rod being the length of a wooden pole used to prod the oxen. As you walk along the headland, the area at the end of the strips where the plows turned, you notice that the earth is slightly raised. Centuries of plowing in the same direction, always turning the soil toward the center of the strip, created a ridge and furrow pattern. On a misty morning, you can still see these undulating waves in the grass of old English parks. This system required a level of communal cooperation that we might find stifling today. Because the strips were open, everyone had to plant the same crop at the same time. You couldn't decide to grow peas if your neighbor was growing wheat, because after the harvest, the entire village released their cattle into the open field to graze on the stubble. The boring schedule of the village was the law. But as the centuries passed, a movement began that would shatter this communal world: enclosure. Wealthy landowners began to fence off the common land, turning the long, narrow strips into the large, private squares we recognize today. This process was long, litigious, and often heartbreaking for the poor, but it left us with a peculiar cultural relic: the lawn. When the elite fenced off their land, they no longer needed to grow crops on every inch. They began to keep short, grazed grass around their manor houses as a status symbol, a way of saying, "I am so wealthy I don't need to use this land for food." Your weekend chore of mowing the grass is, in fact, a 500-year-old tradition of imitating medieval aristocrats who had successfully enclosed the common soil. As the sun sets over the ridge and furrow, you realize that the very way we view property was forged in the turn of an ox team. We are a linear society because the moldboard plow was too heavy to turn in a circle. But while the peasants were measuring the earth in acres, a new class of people in the growing cities was beginning to measure something much more abstract: value. As trade expanded, the boring counting of sheep and wheat became too complex for simple memory. Standing amidst the vast, undulating ribbons of the open field system, you begin to realize that this wasn't just a way of farming, it was a way of living. In our modern, individualistic world, we often view our property as a private kingdom. But for the medieval peasant, the boring management of these strips was a social contract. You were inextricably tied to your neighbor, not by choice, but by the physical requirements of the earth and the technology of the age. Consider the boon work. In addition to farming your own strips, you owed a specific number of days of labor to the lord of the manor. This was the tax of the era, paid in sweat rather than coin. You might spend 3 days a week plowing the lord's domain, the land kept for his own profit, before you could touch your own soil. This repetitive, mandated labor created a culture of synchronized time. Because no one had a fence, everyone had to follow the same calendar. The village elders would meet to decide the breaking of the fowl of the day when the cattle were allowed to enter the harvested fields to graze. If you were slow to harvest your wheat, your neighbor's cows might trample it. This enforced a communal pace that eliminated the modern concept of getting ahead. The goal was not to innovate or expand, but to maintain the balance. This balance was maintained through the courtleet. This was a local, boring administrative court where the villagers themselves acted as the jury. They didn't deal with high crimes like treason, they dealt with nuisances. Someone's pig had escaped and rooted up a neighbor's garden. Someone had moved a mere stone, a boundary marker, a few inches to steal a bit of soil. Someone had failed to clear their section of the drainage ditch. These tiny, petty disputes are the direct ancestors of your modern homeowners association (HOA) or local zoning boards. The idea that your neighbors have a legal right to tell you how to maintain your property is a medieval survival. The nuisance laws we follow today, limiting noise, controlling weeds, or regulating where you can park a car, are built on the 800-year-old principle that your private actions cannot interfere with the communal peace. But there was another boring tradition born in these fields, the three-field system. Medieval farmers weren't scientists, but they were keen observers of exhaustion, both their own and the soil's. They knew that if you planted wheat in the same spot every year, the earth grew tired and the stalks grew thin. They divided their land into 3 great sections. In the first field, they planted winter crops like wheat or rye. In the second, they planted spring crops like peas, beans, or barley. The third field was left fallow. It remained unplanted for an entire year to rest. This rotation was a revolutionary piece of boring technology. By planting beans and peas legumes, they inadvertently replenished the nitrogen in the soil, though they didn't have a word for nitrogen yet. This increased the food supply, which allowed the population to grow, which led to the expansion of cities. You are likely eating a diet enabled by this medieval rotation. The sheer abundance of modern calories can be traced back to the moment a 12th century village decided to leave 1/3 of its land empty for the sake of the future. As you watch the oxen slowly plodding toward the headland, you might notice the pinter. This was a village official whose sole, boring job was to catch stray livestock and put them in the pound-a stone enclosure. To get your cow back, you had to pay a small fine. We still have impound lots for cars today. The vocabulary has shifted from livestock to vehicles, but the medieval logic of orderly transit remains. Even the way you walk through a park today is influenced by these fields. Many modern public footpaths in Europe exist only because they were the original tracks used by peasants to reach their scattered strips. These paths have been walked for so many centuries that they have acquired a legal status known as prescriptive rights. If people have walked a path for 20 years without being stopped, it becomes a public right-of-way. But as the Middle Ages progressed, the pressure on these communal fields grew. The Black Death in the 14th century wiped out so many laborers that the remaining peasants realized their labor was suddenly more valuable. They began to demand wages instead of strips. They began to want their own, enclosed plots of land where they could make their own choices. The boring regularity of the open field was coming to an end, replaced by a new obsession: measurement. If you were going to own a specific piece of land, you needed to know exactly where it ended. You needed a ledger. You needed a way to track the value of what you grew. As we leave the muddy furrows of the village, we follow the wool carts into the bustling market towns. There, in the counting houses of the merchants, a new tradition was being born. It wasn't written in the soil, but in ink, a system of left and right columns that would eventually allow for the creation of every corporation and bank in the modern world. Leave the muddy furrows of the countryside behind and step into the bustling, chaotic atmosphere of a 14th century Italian market square, perhaps in Florence, Venice, or Genoa. The air is no longer filled with the smell of damp earth, but with the scent of Mediterranean spices, expensive wool, and the metallic clink of 100 different coinages. Here, amidst the shouting of traders and the rumble of carts, you are witnessing the birth of modern finance. If you have ever checked your bank balance on an app or felt the slight anxiety of balancing a budget, you are practicing a medieval ritual. The word bank itself is a linguistic fossil. It comes from the Italian banca, which simply meant a bench. In these squares, money changers sat on long wooden benches, spreading out their ledgers and scales. If a banker failed or cheated his customers, his bench was physically smashed, giving us the term bancarrota, or broken bench, the origin of our word bankruptcy. In this era, trade was becoming incredibly complex. A merchant might buy silk in Constantinople, sell it in Venice for gold ducats, use that gold to buy wool in England, and then sell the wool in Flanders for local silver groats. Keeping track of this in your head was impossible. The boring but revolutionary solution that emerged was double-entry bookkeeping. Imagine you are a clerk in the counting house of a wealthy merchant family like the Medici. You are not just writing a list of what you spend. Instead, you are using a system of symmetry. Every transaction is recorded twice, once as a debit to BL. He owes and once as a credit credo. He trusts. One entry tracks where the money went, and the other tracks where it came from. This may seem like a tedious bit of accounting, but it changed the way humans perceive reality. For the first time, a business was not just a pile of gold in a chest, it was an abstract entity that could be measured, analyzed, and projected into the future. It created the balance sheet. The tradition of the fiscal year and the annual audit began here, as merchants realized that by looking at these two columns, they could see the health of their business regardless of how much physical cash was in the room. But there was a major obstacle to this growth: the medieval church's ban on usury, or the charging of interest. Lending money for profit was considered a sin against time itself, because time belonged to God, and one should not profit from its passing. To bypass this, medieval merchants developed the bill of exchange. Imagine you want to buy a shipment of wine from a merchant in Bordeaux, but you don't want to carry a heavy, dangerous chest of gold across bandit-infested roads. Instead, you give your gold to a banker in London. He gives you a bill, a piece of paper stating that his partner in Bordeaux will pay the wine merchant the equivalent amount in local currency. This boring piece of paper is the direct ancestor of the check and the credit card. It allowed value to move faster than physical objects. It turned trust into a currency. When you pay for something today with a digital transfer, you are using a system of abstracted value that was perfected by medieval Italians who were trying to avoid being excommunicated by the Pope for charging interest. The very language of your finances is a medieval survivor. When you look at your capital, you are using the Latin caput, meaning head as in head of cattle. When you see the symbol pound for the British pound, you are looking at a stylized L for Libra, a Roman and medieval unit of weight. Even the check or check comes from the exchequer, the checkered cloth used by medieval accountants as a sort of manual spreadsheet to count coins. As you sit in the counting house, the scratch of your quill is the only sound. You are part of a new class of number crunchers who are slowly taking power away from the knights and the lords. The world is no longer just about who has the sharpest sword, it's about who has the most accurate ledger. However, as the merchants organized their money, they realized they had another boring problem: time. In the fields, time was measured by the sun. In the monastery, it was measured by prayer. But in the market, time was money. The merchants needed a way to coordinate their business that didn't rely on a monk's sundial. While the sophisticated merchants of Italy were refining the art of the ledger, a much more tactile and boring system of accounting was being used in the royal courts of Northern Europe. If the Italian ledger was the ancestor of the spreadsheet, the medieval tally stick was the ancestor of the digital receipt. Imagine you are a sheriff in 12th century England. You have collected taxes from a village in the form of silver pennies, and you are delivering them to the king's treasury. You need a way to prove you paid them money, and the treasury needs a way to ensure you don't come back later claiming you gave them more than you did. In an age where parchment was expensive and many officials were illiterate, the solution was a piece of hazel wood about the length of a human hand. The treasurer would take the stick and cut notches into it. A notch as wide as a thumb represented 1,000 pounds, a notch the width of a pinky was 100 pounds, a single scratch was a penny. Then, the most brilliant part of this boring technology happened. The stick was split down the middle. One half, the stock, was given to the person who paid the money. The other half, the foil, was kept by the treasury. Because the grain of the wood is unique to every branch, the two halves could only ever fit back together perfectly with one another. It was a tamper-proof, medieval blockchain. If you tried to carve an extra notch into your half of the stick to claim you paid more, the grain wouldn't match the treasury's half. This is where we get the term stockholder. You were the person holding the stock of the tally. When we tally up a bill today, or when a story doesn't square with the facts, we are using the language of split hazel sticks. This system was so effective that the British government continued to use it until 1826. In fact, when they finally decided to burn the mountain of accumulated boring wooden records in 1834, the fire was so intense it accidentally burned down the Houses of Parliament. As you stand in the Great Hall of the Exchequer, you see a large table covered in a heavy, checkered cloth, the Scacarium. To the uninitiated, it looks like a giant game of chess. But this cloth was actually a manual calculator. The squares represented different units of currency: pence, shillings, pounds. By moving wooden counters known as jettons across the squares, the clerks could perform complex addition and subtraction in front of witnesses. This visual, public form of accounting created the tradition of transparency in government. The Exchequer wasn't just a place, it was a performance of accuracy. It ensured that the king's peace extended to the king's pocketbook. We still call the head of the British Treasury the Chancellor of the Exchequer, a title that has outlived the checkered cloth by hundreds of years. In the medieval world, time was a slippery thing. A daylight hour in the summer was physically longer than a daylight hour in the winter because the day was simply divided into 12 chunks of light, regardless of how long the sun was up. This was fine for a farmer, but for a merchant whose ships were timed by the tides or a banker whose interest was calculated by the day, it was a disaster. The merchants began to demand a boring time, a time that didn't stretch or shrink with the seasons. They wanted time that was as rigid and predictable as the notches on a tally stick. This demand would lead to a revolution in the town square, placing a giant, ticking machine above the heads of every citizen. As you leave the counting house and the clink of coins fades behind you, a new sound begins to dominate the air. It is a deep, resonant bronze vibration that seems to shake the very stones of the street. It is the sound of the church bell. In the medieval world, the bell was the voice of the city. It was the only clock most people would ever know, and it didn't just tell you what time it was. It told you what you were supposed to be doing. To understand how our modern, rigid work schedule began, you must first enter the boring and repetitive life of a monk. Long before the merchant needed to time a shipment, the monk needed to time a prayer. The rule of Saint Benedict, which governed monastic life across Europe, was an exercise in extreme temporal discipline. The day was divided into the canonical hours: matins at midnight, lauds at dawn, prime 6 a.m., terce 9 a.m., sex noon, none 3 p.m., vespers sunset, and compline before bed. Imagine being a monk in a 12th century abbey. Your life is a loop of boring intervals. You do not wake up when you feel rested. You wake up when the bell tolls for matins. You do not eat when you are hungry, you eat after the bell for sext. This was the first time in human history that large groups of people coordinated their behavior based on an abstract schedule rather than biological urges. However, there was a technical flaw in this system. The monks used sundials or water clocks clepsydras to track these hours. Because they divided the period between sunrise and sunset into 12 equal parts, an hour in the summer was roughly 75 minutes long, while an hour in the winter was only about 45 minutes. This was seasonal time. It was fluid, organic, and, for the growing class of city dwellers, incredibly frustrating. As the 13th century progressed, the boring requirements of the textile industry began to clash with the monk's hour. In cities like Florence or Bruges, thousands of workers were now employed in large dye works and weaving sheds. The owners needed to know exactly how long their employees were working to calculate wages. They couldn't rely on a bell that changed its rhythm with the seasons. They began to install work bells or cloches de l'ouvrier. These bells signaled the start of the shift, the lunch break, and the end of the day. But the bells still relied on human tolling, which was prone to error. The world was waiting for a boring machine that could tick at the same rate, day or night, summer or winter. The solution came from the monasteries themselves, but it was quickly hijacked by the merchants. It was the weight-driven mechanical clock. Early clocks didn't have faces or hands. They were simply giant, iron skeletons hidden away in towers, using a falling weight and a rhythmic escapement mechanism to strike a bell. The tick-tock of the virgin foliate escapement was the heartbeat of the modern world. For the first time, time was democratized. It was no longer a secret kept by the monks in their cloisters. It was a loud, metallic fact that governed everyone in the city square. This shift created the tradition of the hourly wage. If time was now a series of identical, measurable blocks, then labor could be bought in blocks too. The boring regularity of the clock's tick allowed for the creation of the first modern employment contracts. You were no longer paid for the task, you were paid for the time. Every time you clock in or look at your phone to see how many minutes are left in your shift, you are participating in a 13th century revolution. We stopped living by the sun and started living by the machine. We became obsessed with punctuality, a word derived from the Latin punctus point, meaning being on the exact point of the clock's strike. But as the bells of the city towers synchronized the workers, another boring ritual was taking place inside the homes of the people. While the clock regulated their labor, the hearth regulated their survival. And nothing was more essential, more regulated, or more boring than the daily production of the loaf of bread. As you stand in the shadow of a great stone bell tower in a 14th century city, you are witnessing the birth of the grid. The mechanical clock did more than just tell time, it chopped the continuous flow of human life into equal, boring, and tradable units. Before the clock, time was like a river, varying in speed and depth. After the clock, time became like a stack of identical bricks. This transition was not without resistance. Imagine you are a weaver in a medieval textile workshop. For generations, your family worked until the light failed or until the task was done. There was a natural ebb and flow to the day. But now, the city council has installed a great clock in the belfry. It doesn't care if you are tired or if the sun is still high. When the hammer strikes the bronze at 6 p.m., the work must stop. If you haven't finished your quota, you aren't paid for the day. This was the beginning of industrial discipline. The boring regularity of the clock created a new kind of social tension. In 1355, the city of Aire-sur-la-Lys in France was granted the right to build a bell tower specifically to regulate the hours of the workers. The bells were no longer calling you to save your soul through prayer, they were calling you to sell your time for silver. The tradition of the lunch break also finds its roots in this medieval mechanical shift. In the monastic schedule, the midday meal followed the office of sex the 6th hour. As the secular workday took over, the noon bell became the signal for laborers to drop their tools. Because the mechanical clock ensured that noon happened at the exact same moment every day, regardless of the season, businesses could synchronize. This allowed for the creation of a market time where all shops would close and open simultaneously. We still follow this boring synchronization today. When you find yourself frustrated that a government office is closed for lunch, or when you notice the streets suddenly fill with people at 12 p.m., you are experiencing a 700-year-old medieval coordination tactic. But the clock also introduced a new psychological burden: punctuality. In the early Middle Ages, if you agreed to meet someone at dawn or after the mid-morning mess, there was a grace period of nearly an hour. Life was approximate. But with the ticking of the escapement, life became exact. To be on time meant to be on the point of the strike. This created the modern concept of the deadline, originally a boundary that one could not cross, but eventually evolving into a temporal limit that dictated the pace of professional life. The mechanical clock even changed the way we think about our own bodies. We began to view the human heart and the lungs as mechanisms that functioned like the gears of a clock. This boring mechanical worldview, born from the need to time wool production, eventually laid the groundwork for modern medicine and physics. As the evening bell tolls, the curfew from the French couvre-feu, meaning cover the fire, you see the townspeople retreating to their homes. The law required everyone to extinguish their hearths to prevent the wooden city from burning down in the night. This was another boring regulation that saved countless lives and established the tradition of the closing time. But inside those homes, as the fires were dimmed, the focus shifted to the most fundamental of all medieval traditions, the daily bread. While the clock governed the hours, the grain governed survival. The production of bread was so critical that it was managed with a level of bureaucratic boringness that would make a modern food inspector proud. Step into the warmth of a medieval communal oven. In a world where most peasant huts were made of timber, wattle, and highly flammable straw, having a private oven was a dangerous luxury. Instead, the village or the city neighborhood shared a single, massive stone hearth. This oven was the heart of the community, but it was also a site of intense legal scrutiny. Nothing in the medieval world was more regulated, more inspected, or more boring in its administrative detail than the production of bread. You might think of bread as a simple food, but to the medieval mind, it was the primary source of life and the most likely spark for a riot. If the price of bread rose too high, or the quality dropped too low, the social order would collapse. To prevent this, King Henry III of England enacted a law in 1266 that would remain on the books for over 500 years, the Assize of Bread and Ale. This law is a masterpiece of medieval boring history. It didn't just say bread should be good, it created a complex mathematical relationship between the price of a bushel of wheat and the weight of a loaf of bread. As the price of wheat went up, the weight of the loaf had to go down, so that the price of a single penny loaf remained constant. This allowed even the poorest person to know exactly what their penny should buy. Imagine you are a baker in 1300. Your life is governed by the bread weighers officials who could burst into your shop at any moment to weigh your dough. If your bread was found to be light underweight, the punishment was public and humiliating. You would be drawn through the streets on a wooden hurdle, with the offending loaf tied around your neck, while the neighbors you had tried to cheat jeered at you. This extreme pressure led to one of our most famous boring traditions, the baker's dozen. To ensure they never accidentally fell below the legal weight and faced the hurdle, bakers began to add a 13th loaf to every order of 12. It was a 13th century insurance policy against a 13th century prison sentence. When you buy a baker's dozen of bagels today, You are participating in a survival strategy born of medieval consumer protection laws. The assize also categorized bread by its social rank. There was manchet, the fine, white wheaten bread for the nobility, cheat, a slightly coarser whole wheat bread for the middle class, and horse bread, a dark, heavy mass of beans, peas, and bran eaten by the poor and, as the name suggests, horses. This categorization created the tradition of the standardized loaf. We still see this in the way modern bread is sold, with specific regulations on what can be called whole wheat or sourdough. The medieval authorities understood that the only way to keep a market honest was through the boring application of scales and measures. But the tradition of the loaf went beyond the law. It was also about community. Because you had to bring your dough to the communal oven, the bakery became the village's information hub. While waiting for the bread to rise, you would hear the news of the parish, the gossip of the manor, and the warnings of the harvest. This created a culture of communal baking that survives in the festive loaves of holidays, the braided challah, the fruit-filled panettone, or the hot cross buns of Easter. These were breads that were too complex for a daily meal, designed to be shared at the very oven that sustained the village all year. As the baker pulls the long wooden peel out of the oven, the smell of toasted grain fills the air. It is a scent that hasn't changed in 1,000 years. But as you watch the villagers take their loaves and depart, you notice one man who isn't carrying bread. He is carrying a small, wax-sealed parchment. He is an official, a man whose job is to prove that what is written is true. While the baker regulated the weight of food, this man, the notary, regulated the weight of a person's word. As you stand by the glowing embers of the communal oven, watching the village baker move with practiced, boring efficiency, you begin to see that this space was the ultimate medieval social equalizer. In our modern world, we value the private kitchen as a sign of independence, but in the 13th century, the shared oven was a masterpiece of medieval resource management and community law. This wasn't just about heat, it was about the banalities. In the feudal system, the lord of the manor often held a monopoly on the big three of village life: the mill to grind the grain, the press to make the wine or cider, and the oven to bake the bread. Using these facilities wasn't a choice, it was a boring legal obligation. You paid a small fee, usually a portion of your dough or a few pennies, to use the Lord's oven. This created a very specific set of traditions regarding food safety and identification. Because dozens of families were bringing their dough to the same oven at the same time, how did you ensure you got your own loaf back? The solution was the bread mark. Every family had a unique symbol, a precursor to the modern trademark, which they would press into the top of their dough. Some would use a simple cross, others a specific series of pricks with a fork, and others a carved wooden stamp. When you see the decorative scoring on a modern artisanal sourdough loaf today, you are looking at a decorative survival of a medieval ID tag designed to prevent a peasant from accidentally eating his neighbor's coarser horse bread. But the oven also dictated the social architecture of the day. Because the oven took hours to reach the correct temperature, the baking had to happen in a specific order. The boring schedule was dictated by the heat. First, when the oven was at its hottest, the fine white manchet and wheaten loaves were baked. As the temperature dropped, the heavier rye and bean breads went in. Finally, when the oven was cooling, The villagers would use the residual heat to dry herbs, toast grain for ale, or slow-cook pottage, a thick stew that would sit in a clay pot for hours. This slow cooking method is the direct ancestor of the modern crock pot and the tradition of the Sunday roast. In many parts of Europe, the tradition of bringing a pot of beans or meat to the local baker on Sunday morning to be picked up after church lasted well into the 20th century. The boring physics of a cooling stone oven shaped the culinary habits of entire nations. The baker also held a unique, almost priestly position in the village. Because they managed the mother yeast or the sourdough starter, they were the keepers of the community's biological legacy. These starters were passed down through generations, some lasting hundreds of years. Every time you eat a piece of sourdough today, you are engaging in a medieval tradition of continuous life, a boring but miraculous chain of fermentation that connects your breakfast to a 14th century kitchen. However, as cities grew, the communal village oven transformed into the professional bakery guild. The regulations became even stricter. The boring details of the size of bread we discussed in Section 1 were expanded to include the notary's seal. If a baker wanted to export bread to another city, he needed a document proving his measurements were honest. This brings us to a crucial transition. The medieval world was moving away from the word of honor toward the written proof. Whether it was the weight of a loaf, the boundaries of a field, or the terms of a marriage, people began to demand a permanent, boring record. At the edge of the market square, away from the heat of the oven, sits a man with a small portable desk strapped to his chest. He doesn't produce bread, and he doesn't weave cloth. He produces certainty. He is the notary public, and he is about to invent the way you sign your life away on a mortgage. Step out of the heat of the bakery and into the cooler, shadowed arcade of a 13th century Italian piazza. Here, among the shouting merchants and the heavy carts, you find a man sitting at a simple wooden desk. He wears a long, sober robe, and his fingers are perpetually stained with a dark, stubborn ink. This is the notary public. In a world where most people cannot read or write, and where a person's word might be forgotten or conveniently reimagined after a few years, the notary provides the boring but essential service of permanence. You might find the process of getting a document notarized today to be a tedious errand, but you are participating in a legal tradition that saves civilization from a total collapse of trust. The medieval notary was more than a clerk, he was a public person. His authority didn't come from his wealth or his family name, but from a commission granted by either the emperor or the pope. This gave him the power to create public instruments, documents that were legally authentic. If a notary wrote it down and applied his unique mark, the law accepted it as the absolute truth, even if the witnesses were dead and the original parties had disappeared. Imagine you are a merchant named Giovanni. You are lending 100 gold florins to a ship captain to buy silk in the Levant. You go to the notary. You don't just sign a paper, you perform a ritual. The notary asks you both to swear an oath. He then writes the details into his protocol book, his private ledger. This is the boring heart of the tradition. The protocol book was the property of the state, and if the notary died, his books were kept in a public archive. This created the first public record system. For the first time, the truth was no longer locked in someone's head or hidden in a private chest, it was held in a public office. When you look up a property deed or a birth certificate today, you are utilizing the boring archival system perfected by medieval Italian notaries. But the most distinctive part of this story is the signum. Because signatures could be forged, every notary had a unique, incredibly complex hand-drawn mark. These marks were masterpieces of boring complexity, interlocking knots, crosses, and geometric shapes that would be nearly impossible to replicate perfectly. This mark was the medieval version of a digital encryption key. It wasn't just a decoration, it was a legal seal that bound the document to the notary's specific authority. When you see a notary today press a raised seal into a piece of paper or stick a gold foil star onto a document, you are seeing the ghost of the signum. We still feel, instinctively, that a stamped document is more real than a plain one. That is a 700-year-old psychological reflex. The notary also introduced the concept of the standardized contract. To save time, they developed formulas, pre-written chunks of legal text that covered every possible boring scenario. Name, being of sound mind, or to heaven to hold from this day forward. These phrases, which we still see in modern contracts, were hammered out in the Middle Ages to ensure there were no loopholes. They were boring by design, because in the law, boredom is safety. But as the notary's influence grew, so did the complexity of the world he was trying to document. Trade was no longer just about two men in a square, it was about massive networks of people, many of whom would never meet. This led to the next great boring innovation, the company. As the sun moves across the stone piazza, the notary's desk remains a hive of boring but critical activity. While the knights are busy with their grand displays of chivalry and the kings are occupied with territorial wars, the notary is doing the quiet work that actually holds the world together. He is creating public trust. Before the rise of the notary, if you had a dispute over a contract, you had to bring witnesses into court. These witnesses might be old, they might be bribed, or they might simply misremember the details. This made long-term investment incredibly risky. The notary's great boring contribution was the protocol book. In this book, the notary recorded the Abbreviatura A shortened, essential version of every contract he oversaw. If the original parchment held by the merchant was lost at sea or burned in a fire, the truth still lived in the notary's book. This shifted the weight of legal proof from human memory to the written record. We take this for granted today, but it was a seismic shift in human consciousness. We stopped trusting people and started trusting the file. This practice birthed the tradition of the audit trail. In the medieval world, the notary's books were subject to inspection by the guild or the city-state. A notary whose books were messy or incomplete could lose his license. Every time you save a version of a digital document or an accountant tracks a paper trail, you are following the 13th century protocol of the Italian noting. But there was another boring detail that the notaries perfected: the date and place. In early medieval documents, dating was chaotic. Someone might date a letter by the 3rd year of King Philip or the feast day of St. Jude. The notary standardized the way we mark time in the law. They included the year of the incarnation, the month, the day, and, most importantly, the specific location, often down to the room or the specific street corner where the deal was struck. This created the legal concept of jurisdiction. By noting exactly where a document was signed, the notary determined which city's laws applied to it. This boring administrative habit is why, when you sign a contract today, it often specifies that the agreement is governed by the laws of a specific state or country. You are tethering your digital signature to a physical piece of earth, just as a merchant in 1280 tethered his wool trade to a specific pillar in the market of Lucca. The notary also acted as the world's first compliance officer. They were required to ensure that the parties involved were legally allowed to make the deal. They checked if a person was of age, if a woman had the required guardian present according to the restrictive laws of the time, and if the parties understood the boring Latin formulas they were agreeing to. They were the original human firewall against fraud. As the medieval era progressed, the notary's influence spread north from Italy into France, Germany, and eventually the Netherlands. However, in England, a different boring tradition was forming. The English didn't use notaries for everything. Instead, they relied on the Chancellor's seal and the common law. This split created the two different legal worlds we still live in today: the civil law of Europe and the common law of the English-speaking world. Yet, regardless of the system, the goal was the same: to make sure the word outlived the breath. As you watch the notary pack up his ink and parchment at the end of the day, you see a group of young men waiting by his desk. They aren't merchants, they are apprentices. They are there to learn the boring art of the law, but they also represent a new kind of social contract. They aren't just students, they are employees who live with their master. Close your eyes and imagine a home that is also a factory, a school, and a dormitory. In the medieval city, the line between work and life did not exist. There was no commute. If you were an apprentice, your master's house was your entire world. This story is about the boring but fundamental history of room and board, a tradition that shaped the modern concept of what an employer owes an employee beyond a simple wage. In the 14th century, if you wanted to enter a trade, your parents entered into a legal contract called an indenture. The name comes from the boring way the document was created. The contract was written twice on a single piece of parchment, and then the two halves were cut apart in a jagged, zigzag line, forming teeth or indentations. This ensured that the two halves could only be matched with each other, preventing forgery. But the content of these boring contracts was revolutionary. Unlike a modern job where you trade hours for dollars, the medieval apprentice traded autonomy for care. The master didn't just pay the apprentice; in fact, usually, no money changed hands at all. Instead, the master was legally bound to provide meat, drink, and clothing, as well as the secrets of the craft. This is the origin of the apprentice's bed. The master was legally required to provide a place for the apprentice to sleep, often on a straw pallet in the workshop itself or in a shared loft. This boring requirement established the precedent that an employer is responsible for the physical well-being of their workforce. When you see a modern tech campus providing free meals, gym memberships, or even sleeping pods, you are looking at a high-tech version of a 600-year-old medieval house rule. Imagine yourself as that apprentice. Your day doesn't start with a clock in, it starts when the master's wife calls you to breakfast. You eat the same pottage as the master's children. You are part of the familia. This created a deep, often stifling, sense of loyalty. The boring details of your life, what you wore, who you spoke to, even your hair length, were governed by the master. In exchange, you were safe from the fluctuations of the market. If the price of grain went up, the master still had to feed you. You had job security in its most primal, literal form. This tradition also gave us the apprentice's Sunday. Because the apprentice lived in the shop, they were never off duty except for the holy days. To prevent burnout and social unrest, the guilds enforced boring rules about rest. These mandated breaks are the distant ancestors of our modern weekends and paid time off. The medieval mind understood that a worker who never leaves the bed of the workshop eventually becomes a poor craftsman. However, as the Middle Ages progressed and cities became more crowded, the apprentice's bed started to create a problem of geography. Where did the workshop end and the city begin? How did you define the boundaries of the neighborhood when everyone lived where they worked? This led to the creation of the parish, the most boring administrative unit in history, yet the one that still determines your local taxes, your school district, and even your zip code today. Life as a medieval apprentice was a boring cycle of repetition. But it was anchored by a profound concept, in loco parentis. Because you were often as young as 12 when you entered the master's household, the law viewed your employer not as a boss, but as a temporary parent. This meant the boring details of your contract extended far beyond the workbench and into the very fiber of your character. If you were caught drinking in a tavern or playing at dice, it wasn't just a personal failing, it was a breach of your employment contract. The master had the legal right, and the duty, to physically discipline you. In the medieval view, a craftsman who couldn't control his impulses couldn't be trusted with the mysteries of the guild. This created a tradition of employer oversight that persists in modern professional codes of conduct. When a modern company fires an employee for bringing the company into disrepute through their private actions, they are exercising a power that was codified in the medieval apprentice's indenture. But let's look at the most boring part of this arrangement, the board. The word board literally refers to the wooden table where the household ate. In the Middle Ages, you didn't get a lunch hour to go find a sandwich, you sat at the board of your master. This communal dining was the first form of an employee benefit. Because the master was responsible for your health, the quality of the food was a matter of guild regulation. If a master was found to be feeding his apprentices putrid meat or insufficient bread, the guild could fine him or even take his apprentices away. This created the first minimum standards for working conditions. The boring inspections of the kitchen were just as important as the inspections of the workshop. We see the legacy of this today in OSHA regulations and workplace safety laws that mandate access to clean water, rest areas, and ventilation. The apprentice's bed also established the tradition of resident labor. For centuries, if you worked in a great house, a stable, or a shop, your total compensation included your housing. While this system largely faded with the Industrial Revolution, it survived in specific boring pockets of the modern world. Think of resident doctors in hospitals, live-in au pairs, or even university professors living in faculty housing. These are all descendants of the medieval apprentice who slept within earshot of his master's call. As an apprentice, your goal was to eventually graduate to become a journeyman. As we discussed in Story 1, the journeyman was a traveler. But here is the boring administrative twist. When a journeyman arrived in a new city, he didn't check into a hotel. He went to the guild hall. The guild hall was the boring precursor to the modern employment agency and social club. The guild kept a list of masters who needed help and provided a place for the journeyman to stay while he looked for work. This ensured that skilled labor was distributed where it was needed, and it kept masterless men, the medieval term for the unemployed, off the streets. This was the first attempt at a coordinated labor market. But as the evening drew in and the apprentice climbed into his shared bed in the loft, he could hear the bells of the parish church nearby. The house he lived in was part of a street, the street was part of a ward, and the ward was part of the parish. While the master governed his work, the parish governed his belonging. As the cities grew denser and the boring needs of the poor became more pressing, the church and the state had to decide exactly where one neighborhood ended and another began. They needed to know who was responsible for the boring tasks of cleaning the gutters and feeding the orphans. Step out of the apprentice's cramped loft and into the cool, morning air of a medieval village or a London ward. You are about to participate in one of the most boring yet essential rituals of the Middle Ages, the annual survey of the parish. In a world without satellite imagery, GPS, or even accurate paper maps, how did a community know exactly where its responsibilities ended and its neighbors began? The answer was a tradition known as beating the bounds. Once a year, usually during irrigation tide, the days leading up to Ascension Day, the priest, the parish clerk, and a boisterous crowd of local boys would set out on a long, circuitous walk. They weren't just taking a stroll, they were visualizing the law. The parish was the fundamental unit of medieval life. It was your church, your welfare office, your tax district, and your primary social circle. If you were poor and needed food, only your parish was legally bound to help you. If a bridge broke, only the people within the parish lines had to fix it. Imagine you are one of the young boys in the procession. As you reach a specific oak tree, a large stone, or a bend in the stream, the priest stops. He recites a prayer. But then something boring and slightly strange happens. The older men take willow wands and begin to strike the boundary marker, or, in some cases, they would pick up one of the boys and bump his head gently against the stone. This wasn't cruelty, it was mnemonic engineering. In an age of illiteracy, the community's map lived in the collective memory of its children. By associating a physical location with a specific, memorable event like a bumping or a shared snack of cakes and ale at a certain gate, the parish ensured that 30 years later, when those boys were elders, they could testify in court exactly where the boundary lay. This boring walk was the medieval version of a property title search. We still follow this tradition in the way we organize our modern world. Your zip code, your voting precinct, and your school district are all direct descendants of the medieval parish boundary. Even the word parish survives in Louisiana's administrative divisions and throughout the United Kingdom's local government. The idea that you belong to a specific patch of dirt, and that this dirt dictates which services you receive, is a medieval survival that has outlived almost every other form of feudalism. But the parish was more than just a line on the ground, it was the first public welfare system. Long before the modern state provided social safety nets, the parish collected the tithe, 10% of everyone's agricultural output. This was boring to calculate and often sparked resentment, but it created the parish chest. This chest, often a heavy oak box with 3 separate locks so no one person could open it alone, held the funds for the deserving poor, the orphans, and the widows of the neighborhood. This established the tradition of local accountability. Because the money was collected and spent within the sight of the church spire, the community knew exactly who was paying in and who was taking out. It created a sense of neighborhood that we still feel today. When you see a local community center or a neighborhood watch sign, you are looking at the modern evolution of the medieval parishioner's sense of duty to his bounds. As the procession finishes its walk and returns to the church, the boring administrative work begins. The parish clerk records any changes, a fallen tree that used to be a marker, or a new fence that encroaches on the common path. This record-keeping was the birth of civil registration. The parish was the only institution that knew when you were born, when you married, and when you died. But as the boundaries of the parish became more rigid, people began to wonder about the boundaries of the body. While the priest cared for the soul within the bounds, the local apothecary was looking into the boring details of the soil itself to find cures for the body's ailments. Step away from the dusty parish ledgers and follow the scent of crushed mint, dried lavender, and pungent resin. We are entering the world of the apothecary, the medieval precursor to the modern pharmacist. In an era long before synthetic chemistry and germ theory, the apothecary shop was a place of boring but vital classification. It was here that the tradition of the materia medica, the systematic cataloging of medicinal substances, was kept alive through the Dark Ages and into the modern medicine cabinet. If you have ever looked at the back of a bottle of herbal tea or a tube of ointment and seen ingredients like valerian root or calendula, you are reading a list that would be perfectly familiar to a 14th century shopkeeper. The apothecary's primary job was the boring task of sourcing and preservation. Unlike a doctor, who focused on the philosophy of the four humors, the apothecary was a technician of the earth. Imagine yourself in a shop in medieval Montpellier or London. The walls are lined with hundreds of small wooden drawers and ceramic jars called albarelli. Each one is labeled with a specific Latin name. This was the first iteration of standardized labeling. The apothecary spent his days in a cycle of repetitive labor, grinding dried roots in a heavy brass mortar, steeping leaves in wine or vinegar to create tinctures, and mixing fats with resins to create unguent salves. This was the birth of the pharmacopoeia. The boring necessity of ensuring that a grain of opium in one shop was the same as a grain in another led to the first regulated weights and measures in medicine. This tradition persists today in the incredibly precise, regulated dosages of your modern prescriptions. The apothecary understood that in medicine, boring consistency was the difference between a cure and a poison. But the real heart of the apothecary's world was the physic garden. In every monastery and behind every urban shop, there was a plot of land dedicated to simple individual plants used for specific ailments. The boring geometry of these gardens, divided into neat, rectangular beds for easy weeding and identification, is the direct ancestor of the modern research lab's organized inventory. Consider the willow. Medieval apothecaries knew that chewing the bark of a willow tree would ease a headache or break a fever. This wasn't magic, it was a boring observation repeated over centuries. In the 19th century, scientists finally isolated the active ingredient, salicylic acid, and turned it into aspirin. When you take a pill for a headache today, you are utilizing the boring botanical data collected by medieval men and women who spent their lives tending to trees and bushes. The apothecary also gave us the tradition of the wholesale supply chain. Because many ingredients like black pepper, ginger, or myrrh had to be imported from the East, the apothecary was part of a global trade network. They had to be experts in boring logistics, how to keep a shipment of dried roots from molding on a ship, or how to spot adulterated saffron fake spices mixed with yellow flower petals. This focus on quality control and provenance is exactly what modern pharmaceutical companies do today to ensure the active ingredient in your medicine is pure. As the apothecary carefully pours a dark liquid into a glass vial, he is not just selling a potion, he is selling professional knowledge. He is part of a guild, and like the blacksmiths we met in Story 1, he guards his trade secrets. But as the medieval world grows more complex, the clothes the apothecary wears, and the clothes you wear to your own job, start to matter as much as the products being sold. As you step out of the apothecary's aromatic shop, the first thing you notice about the people passing by isn't their faces, but their textures. In the medieval city, your clothes were your resume, your ID card, and your social boundary. This story is about the boring administrative obsession with fabric, a history of sumptuary laws that dictated exactly what you were allowed to wear based on your income and your job. In the 14th century, as the merchant class grew wealthy, they began to buy the same fine silks and furs previously reserved for the nobility. The aristocrats, horrified by this blurring of ranks, passed a series of incredibly detailed and boring laws. These weren't about fashion, they were about information architecture. They wanted to ensure that at a single glance, anyone could tell exactly where you fit in the hierarchy of the world. Imagine being a prosperous merchant's wife in 1363 England. You have the money for a gown of deep purple silk lined with ermine, but a new law makes it illegal for you to wear it. If your husband doesn't earn a certain amount of silver per year, you are restricted to common wool and local furs like rabbit or fox. These laws even dictated the length of the pollaines, those absurdly long, pointed shoes. A nobleman could have points 24 inches long, while a commoner was limited to a mere 6. This created the tradition of the professional uniform. Because the law forced people to dress according to their station, different trades began to adopt specific colors and styles of clothing to identify themselves. This was known as livery. A member of the Grocers Guild might wear a specific shade of green, while a lawyer wore a long, sober robe of dark blue or black. We see the boring legacy of these laws every time we look at a modern workplace. Why do judges wear black robes? Why do doctors wear white coats? Why does a white-collar worker wear a different shirt than a blue-collar worker? These are all modern versions of medieval sumptuary logic. We have replaced legal punishments with social expectations, but the goal remains the same: to communicate rank and expertise through a standardized visual language. But the most fascinating boring detail of medieval clothing was the button. Before the 13th century, clothes were mostly held together by pins, laces, or simple belts. The invention of the functional buttonhole allowed clothes to be made form-fitting. This required a new level of precision in tailoring. It also created a new form of social signaling. Buttons were expensive, therefore, Having a row of 50 tiny buttons down your sleeve was a boring but effective way to show off your wealth. This obsession with buttons and fit led to the creation of the standardized size. To produce livery for hundreds of guild members, tailors began to move away from purely bespoke custom-made clothing and started developing boring templates based on average measurements. This was the distant ancestor of the small, medium, large system that governs your wardrobe today. As you look at the crowd in the marketplace, you see a sea of boring regulations made manifest in wool, silk, and linen. But as the sun sets and the city gates are barred, the people return to their homes to sleep. And it is in the boring ritual of the will and testament, written by the light of a single candle, that we find how these clothes, tools, and coins were passed from one generation to the next. As we reach the final boring tradition of our journey, we move from the marketplace and the guild hall into the quietest room of a medieval house. On a small table, a piece of parchment sits ready. A notary or a parish priest dips a quill into ink. We are witnessing the creation of the last will and testament. In the modern world, we think of a will as a way to pass on a house or a bank account. But in the 14th century, wealth was tangible, physical, and incredibly personal. The boring administrative detail of the medieval will is where we find the origin of our obsession with itemized property and the legal concept of the executor. Imagine you are a prosperous weaver named Thomas. You aren't just leaving your estate to your children. You are listing every boring item you own. Because in an age of scarcity, a single brass cooking pot or a set of silver spoons was a significant inheritance. Medieval wills are filled with entries like, "To my daughter Alice, my second best bed and the blue kirtle, to my son John, my iron-bound chest and the heavy loom." This level of detail created the tradition of the inventory. Before a will could be settled, an official list had to be made of everything in the house, down to the last spoon and stoolie. This boring process is the ancestor of modern estate law and the inventory and appraisal process that still happens in probate courts today. It established the principle that the law doesn't just care about money, it cares about the specific, physical stuff that makes up a life. But who ensures Thomas's wishes are actually carried out? This led to the creation of the executor. In the medieval world, you didn't just pick a friend, you chose someone who would answer to God for your debts. The executor's boring duty was to pay off your creditors first, then distribute the chattels, your movable property, and finally ensure your soul was taken care of through charitable donations to the parish. The word chattel itself is a linguistic relic of this era. It comes from the same root as cattle. In the boring language of the law, your property was once measured by the things that moved: your cows, your tools, your clothes. Today, we still use the term chattel in legal contracts to distinguish your stuff from the real estate, the land itself. This tradition also gave us the probate court. Because the church was responsible for the soul, it claimed jurisdiction over the boring distribution of personal goods. This meant that for centuries, the same people who managed your prayers also managed your paperwork. This fusion of the sacred and the administrative is why many of our modern legal rituals, the swearing of oaths, the formal language, the witnessing, feel strangely like a religious ceremony. As Thomas's will is sealed with a drop of red wax and his signet ring, He is ensuring that his boring life's work doesn't vanish. He is tethering his memory to a piece of parchment that will outlive his body. While the will and testament organized the legacy of the individual, the medieval world still faced a massive boring problem. How do you get from the parish to the market without being robbed? We often imagine medieval travel as a lawless crawl through dark forests, but in reality, it was governed by one of the most significant pieces of boring infrastructure legislation in history, the Statute of Winchester 1285. This law didn't build new roads, instead, it standardized the King's Highway. It established the tradition that the road was not just a strip of dirt, but a legal zone of protection. If you were on the King's Highway, you were under the King's peace. But the most fascinating part of this statute was the boring requirement for vegetation management. The law mandated that all brush, bushes, and trees be cleared for 200 feet on either side of any major road connecting market towns. The reason was purely tactical, to prevent malefactors bandits from lurking in ambush. This boring administrative rule for the landscape created the wide, open verges we still see alongside modern highways and country roads. When you drive down a road today and see a broad, grassy shoulder before the tree line begins, you are seeing a 700-year-old security protocol designed to keep highwaymen from jumping out at a wool merchant's cart. But the statute went further. It formalized the hue and cry. If a crime was committed on the road, every able-bodied man in the parish was legally required to drop their tools and join the chase upon hearing a shout or a horn. This was the medieval version of a community alert system. If a village failed to catch the criminal, the entire community was held financially liable for the victim's losses. This created a culture of boring collective responsibility. It turned every citizen into a part-time law enforcer. We see the legacy of the hue and cry in our modern concept of citizens' arrest and the public duty to report crimes. It established that safety wasn't just the job of a police force which didn't exist yet, but a boring daily obligation of the neighborhood. The roads themselves were maintained through statute labor. Just as you owed days of plowing to the Lord, you owed days of shoveling to the road. Each year, the surveyor of the highways, usually a local farmer who didn't really want the job, would coordinate the villagers to fill in potholes and clear drainage ditches. This boring and often poorly performed work was the birth of local public works. But the highway wasn't just for people, it was for information. Along these roads traveled the messengers, men who wore the livery of a lord or a king. To ensure these messengers could travel fast, the boring tradition of posting began. Specific inns were designated as posts where a messenger could swap a tired horse for a fresh one. This system of stations is why we have the post office today. Even the word mail comes from the medieval mail, a leather bag used to carry letters on a horse's saddle. Your morning delivery is a high-speed evolution of a medieval rider galloping between roadside inns. As you stand on the edge of the King's Highway, watching the dust settle after a messenger passes, you realize that the road connects more than just towns. It connects the boring laws of the city to the boring customs of the coast. And at the end of every road, there is a port, where the rules of the land met the boring and terrifyingly complex world of the sea. Leave the dusty, brush-cleared margins of the King's Highway and stand upon the salt-crusted docks of a 14th-century port like London, Bruges, or Genoa. The boring administrative logic of the land had to change the moment it touched the water. The sea was a place of total uncertainty. Storms, pirates, and shifting sands meant that a merchant's entire fortune could vanish in a single afternoon. To manage this chaos, medieval sailors and merchants developed a boring system of maritime law and risk mitigation that still governs every shipping container crossing the ocean today. The most important boring document at sea was the Sea Loan Comenda. Because the church forbade usury interest, merchants couldn't simply loan money for a voyage. Instead, they became partners in the risk. If the ship returned, the investor took a large share of the profit. If the ship sank, the investor lost everything. This turned every voyage into a boring legal entity, a temporary corporation designed to shield the individual from total ruin. But what happened when a ship was caught in a storm and the captain had to throw cargo overboard to save the vessel? Who paid for the lost wine or wool? The answer was found in the Lex Rhodia, the Law of Rhodes, which was codified in the medieval Rolls of Oleron. This introduced the concept of general average. The logic was boring but profoundly fair. If one merchant's cargo was sacrificed to save the ship and everyone else's goods, then all the merchants whose goods were saved had to chip in to reimburse the one who lost everything. We still use the word average from the Arabic awar, meaning damage in the insurance industry today to describe this shared loss. When you pay an insurance premium, you're participating in a medieval communal sacrifice ritual. The port was also the birthplace of the Quarantin. In 1377, the city of Ragusa, modern-day Dubrovnik, established a boring administrative rule to fight the Black Death. Any ship coming from an infected area had to wait at anchor for 30 days Trenton. This was later extended to 40 days, or a quarantina. Imagine being a sailor stuck on a ship, staring at the city walls for 40 boring days. You weren't allowed to land, trade, or even touch the dock until your time was up. This was the first time the state used time as a medical barrier. Every time you see a wash your hands sign or follow a public health directive, you are following the boring logic of a medieval harbor master trying to keep the plague at bay. To manage all these ships, ports developed the bill of lading. This was a boring list of everything on the ship, signed by the captain. It acted as a receipt, a contract of carriage, and a document of title. It meant that a merchant in London could sell a cargo of spices that was still on a ship in the middle of the Bay of Biscay. They weren't selling the spices, they were selling the paper. This boring abstraction of goods into paper allowed for the creation of commodity markets. You no longer needed to see the wheat or smell the wool to trade it, you just needed to trust the boring accuracy of the clerk's ink. As the ships were unloaded and the average was calculated, the sailors headed to the taverns. But even there, they were governed by the rules of the sea, which dictated their boring daily rations of ale and hardtack. And as they drank, they told stories of the boring but essential sea charts, portolan charts that guided them through the dark.